A black lawyer walks into court to defend her client, and ends up on trial herself. What happens next will leave you speechless. The courtroom was packed. Not a single seat was empty. The air carried a certain weight, one that came with cases like this. Ones where the truth wasn't enough. Attorney Simone Caldwell knew that feeling well. She had spent over a decade defending clients in cases where justice wasn't guaranteed, especially when race played a role. She smoothed her blazer, exhaled, and glanced toward her client, DeAndre Porter, a 22-year-old black man accused of stealing from the convenience store where he worked. A theft charge that should have never made it this far. The evidence? Circumstantial at best. A security tape too grainy to confirm anything. Witness testimonies full of contradictions. But the prosecutor pushed forward, confident that a jury would see DeAndre as guilty before they saw him as a person. Simone was about to deliver her closing argument. The moment that mattered most. The one that could change this young man's life. She stood, adjusting the papers in front of her. And then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with force. A uniformed officer walked in, his presence slicing through the tension like a knife. Behind him the bailiff followed, his expression unreadable. The murmur in the room grew louder. Simone frowned but kept her posture steady. She had seen enough courtroom theatrics to know when someone was trying to make a statement. The officer walked straight to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, voice crisp, "we need to detain Attorney Caldwell for questioning." Silence. The judge, Judge Ronald Beasley, a man known for his strict adherence to procedure, blinked. "I beg your pardon." Simone's heartbeat didn't speed up. It didn't have to. She had learned long ago to stay calm in moments like these. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice level. The officer, badge number 4071, didn't address her. Instead, he looked at her briefcase on the defense table, then at the Mercedes key fob sitting beside it. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching the description of the one she drove here today," he said, hands resting on his belt. Simone's eyebrows lifted slightly. "My car?" The murmurs in the courtroom turned into hushed whispers. The jury, the audience, even DeAndre. Everyone was watching. The judge cleared his throat. "Officer, I hope you have a compelling reason for interrupting my courtroom in the middle of a trial." "I have a description that matches the suspect and the vehicle," the officer repeated, his stance firm. Simone let out a slow breath through her nose. She had handled countless legal battles, fought for justice in cases where the odds were against her. But this was different. Because today, she wasn't just a defense attorney. She was a black woman in a courtroom, being accused before she even spoke. But the way the officer looked at her, like she was already guilty, told her this wasn't going to be as simple as showing proof. The silence in the courtroom felt like it stretched for miles. All eyes were on Simone. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. The officer, badge 4071, stood firm, shoulders squared like he was bracing for resistance. Simone tilted her head slightly. She wasn't rattled. Not yet. She reached for the key fob, holding it between two fingers. "This car?" she asked, her voice controlled. "The black Mercedes parked outside? The one I've owned for 3 years?" The officer didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone in the gallery muttered, "You gotta be kidding me." Judge Beasley straightened in his seat. "Counselor Caldwell is an officer of this court. I find it highly irregular that an attorney in the middle of a trial is being questioned about her own vehicle." The officer finally turned toward the bench. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we have reason to believe the car was stolen. We received a report that a vehicle matching this description was taken from a residence in this area." Simone arched an eyebrow. "And that residence belongs to me?" The officer didn't answer. She inhaled deeply, keeping her temper on a tight leash. Let's not play games. You're saying someone reported my car, which I drove to this courthouse, as stolen. I'd love to see this report. She motioned toward the briefcase sitting in front of her. I have my registration, my insurance, my driver's license, all right here. If you need proof, I can give it to you without disrupting this trial. The officer barely glanced at her belongings. Instead, he took a step forward, eyes narrowing. Ma'am, we'll need you to come down to the station so we can verify that information. A stunned silence swallowed the room whole. Simone's stomach clenched, not out of fear, but out of familiar frustration. She had fought cases where innocent men had been dragged off in handcuffs over a mistaken identity. She had represented clients who were forced to prove their innocence before the system even considered their rights. And now, here she was. She straightened, her voice like steel. Officer, you're asking me, an attorney actively defending a client in court, to leave in the middle of a trial because someone claimed my car was stolen? Yes, ma'am. She let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. You don't even seem interested in checking my paperwork first. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The jury members exchanged glances. Some of them, mostly the black jurors, looked downright angry. Simone turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if this officer insists on treating me like a suspect in front of my client, in your courtroom, then I'd like to remind him that per constitutional law I have the right to remain here unless he is placing me under arrest. Otherwise, this is a clear abuse of authority. The judge hesitated, but before he could respond, another voice rang out. She's right. Another attorney, one of the public defenders, had stood up. This is highly inappropriate, he continued. You can't just walk into a courtroom and disrupt a case based on a vague claim. You didn't even say who filed the report. The officer shifted on his feet. I don't have that information at this time. That did it. The murmurs in the room turned into a full-blown uproar. The judge pounded his gavel. Order! Order! Simone stayed quiet, her hands gripping the defense table. The moment stretched. The judge rubbed his temple, exhaling heavily. But the officer wasn't backing down. And Simone realized this wasn't just about a car anymore. The courtroom felt like it was shrinking. The officer's stance didn't change. Neither did Simone's. Judge Beasley adjusted his glasses and let out a slow breath. Officer, he said, voice tight, you're telling me you came in here to remove an attorney from an active trial over a car. Do you have a warrant? An arrest order? Anything beyond hearsay? The officer's shoulders stiffened, but his tone didn't waver. No, Your Honor, but we do have probable cause based on the report. Simone let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Probable cause? Are you serious? The jury was watching everything, taking it all in. Her client, DeAndre, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had already been sitting through a trial where he had to prove he wasn't a thief. And now, the very lawyer defending him was being accused of stealing too. Simone saw it in his face. That flicker of realization. They never saw us as innocent to begin with. She turned her gaze back to the officer, measuring her words carefully. I'm going to say this once. You are not taking me anywhere. You don't have a warrant. You don't have evidence. And if this is about an alleged stolen car, then you can verify my ownership right here and now, instead of turning this courtroom into a spectacle. The officer's jaw tightened. He knew she was right, but it wasn't about the car anymore. It was about control. And that's when a second officer stepped inside. Another uniform, another reinforcement. The energy in the room shifted again, from disbelief to full-blown tension. Simone heard a chair scrape. One of the jurors, an older black man, had leaned forward, his brows furrowed deeply. You've got to be joking, he muttered under his breath. But it wasn't a joke. The second officer moved toward her defense table, as if positioning himself to escort her out. Simone wasn't going anywhere. She turned to Judge Beasley. Your Honor, you cannot allow this. If I leave this courtroom, I am abandoning my client in the middle of closing arguments. This is not just an insult to me, it's an insult to the legal system you swore to uphold." The judge clenched his jaw. He knew it too. But the moment was bigger than him now. The reporters in the back of the courtroom had their cameras ready. The second they stepped out, it would hit the news. "Black attorney pulled from court over false accusation." Simone could already see the headlines. The first officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Ms. Caldwell, if you resist, this will become a bigger issue than it needs to be." She tilted her head. "Are you arresting me?" Silence. He didn't respond. Because they couldn't. The second they put cuffs on her, they would have to justify it. And there was nothing to justify. Simone exhaled through her nose. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to verify my registration and ownership right now. In this room. In front of everyone. If you find that my name is on that car, you will apologize, and you will walk out of here." Her voice was sharp, each word cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The second officer looked at badge 4071. He hesitated. Then he pressed his radio. "Dispatch, I need a verification on a black Mercedes-Benz. License plate." Simone pulled the registration from her briefcase and slid it across the table. "Here. Save yourself the trouble." The officer took it. Walked toward the side of the room, radio still in hand. The entire courtroom held its breath. The judge sat back in his chair, fingers steepled. The jury exchanged looks. The courtroom audience whispered among themselves. Seconds passed, then minutes. Finally, the second officer's radio crackled. The response was clear. "The vehicle is registered to Simone Caldwell. No reports of theft, no outstanding warrants." Silence. Simone's hands never shook. She folded her arms, watching as the officers exchanged looks. They had nothing. She knew it. They knew it. Judge Beasley's voice was low, controlled. "Well, officers, what now?" The second officer cleared his throat. "Looks like there was a mix-up." "A mix-up?" Simone let out a slow exhale. That's what they always called it. Judge Beasley's gaze darkened. "Then I expect you to remove yourselves from my courtroom immediately." The second officer nodded. He turned, walked out. But badge 4071 hesitated. His pride was bruised. He looked at Simone, still trying to maintain his authority. But there was nothing left to say. So he left too. And just like that, it was over. But Simone knew. It wasn't really over at all. Because DeAndre was still sitting there, watching. And the lesson he had just learned was one that would never leave him. The moment the officers left, the tension didn't break. It lingered, thick, suffocating. Judge Beasley pulled off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. He looked at Simone, then at the jury, then back at her again. "Ms. Caldwell, do you need a moment before continuing your closing arguments?" Simone didn't sit down. She didn't blink. She just exhaled sharply and straightened her posture. "No, Your Honor. I'm ready." A murmur swept through the room. The jury was still rattled. The courtroom audience shifted in their seats. And DeAndre, he looked frozen. Simone turned toward him. His eyes were dark with something that wasn't just fear anymore. It was understanding. She placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him back into the present. "We're still fighting," she whispered. He gave a stiff nod, but his expression didn't change. And that's when she realized something. It didn't matter that she was a lawyer, that she wore a tailored blazer, that she had spent years studying the law, fighting for fairness, making a name for herself in courtrooms just like this one. The second those officers stepped in, she had become just another black person forced to prove they belonged. And DeAndre had watched it happen in real time. She turned back toward the jury, took a breath. And then she made a decision. She wasn't going to deliver the closing argument she had rehearsed last night, the one full of legal analysis and careful rhetoric. No, she was going to give them the truth. Simone stepped forward, walking toward the jury box slowly, deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she started, voice steady. "You just watched what happened in this courtroom. I don't have to explain it to you. You saw it." Some of them looked away, others held her gaze. She continued. "I was accused of stealing a car I own. A car I have proof of ownership for. A car I have driven to this courthouse dozens of times. And still, I was presumed guilty before anyone even looked at the facts." She let the words settle, made them feel it. Then she turned back toward DeAndre. "Now, let me ask you something. If that can happen to me, a lawyer standing in a courtroom, imagine what it's like for my client." A few jurors shifted, some swallowed. They were thinking about it now. Simone nodded slowly. "My client was accused of stealing from the same store where he worked. No clear evidence, no fingerprints, just a blurry security tape and a lot of assumptions." She let that sink in. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And now you have to decide. Are you looking at the facts? Or are you looking at him the same way those officers just looked at me?" The room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of traffic outside. She straightened again. "Because that's what this case is really about. Not evidence, not guilt, but perception." A juror, a white woman in her 50s, shifted uncomfortably. She knew Simone was talking to her. Simone turned to the prosecutor's table. The lead attorney, Matthew Denton, wasn't smirking anymore. He knew what had just happened, and he knew the case was slipping. She returned to the defense table and placed her hands flat on the surface. "The prosecution wants you to believe DeAndre Porter is a thief because someone said he was. I was just accused of stealing because someone said I did. You watched it play out in front of you." She let her next words hang heavy. "You have a choice now. Will you make your decision based on assumptions or actual facts?" Silence. She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense rests." Judge Beasley took a long breath before turning toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to deliberations." The bailiff stood, motioning for the jurors to follow him. They filed out slowly, some with their eyes on Simone, others staring at the floor. She took her seat beside DeAndre. He still hadn't said a word. And then, after a long moment, he whispered, "I don't think they're going to convict me." Simone finally let herself breathe. But this case was bigger than a verdict now. Time in the courtroom moved differently when a jury was deliberating. It stretched, coiled, tightened around everyone who waited. Simone sat next to DeAndre at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was calm on the surface. Inside, she was anything but. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her ribs. The officers might have left, but they took something with them. The illusion of fairness. DeAndre tapped his fingers against the table. "How long do you think it'll take?" "Could be minutes, could be hours." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I still can't believe that happened to you." Simone studied him. "You're surprised?" He hesitated. "I mean, yeah. You're a lawyer." She let out a soft breath. "And?" DeAndre frowned but didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was sinking in. It didn't matter that she was an attorney. That uniform saw her the same way it saw him. Before she could respond, the courtroom doors creaked open. The bailiff stepped in. "The jury has reached a verdict." A sharp silence fell over the room. The crowd murmured. People leaned forward. DeAndre stiffened beside her. Simone placed a hand over his. "No matter what happens, you are not your verdict. He nodded, but his hands were ice cold under hers. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Judge Beasley straightened in his seat. Has the jury reached a decision? The foreperson, a black man in his late 60s, stood up and cleared his throat. We have, Your Honor. Beasley nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded the slip of paper and read the words slowly, so carefully that Simone could already tell. They weren't convicting him. On the charge of grand larceny, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. A wave of relief crashed over Simone, but she kept her composure. DeAndre let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. He slumped forward, covering his face with his hands. The judge nodded once. Mr. Porter, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Simone turned to DeAndre, who was still frozen. You're going home, she said softly. He looked at her, eyes glassy with shock. I don't even know how to feel right now. She gave him a small, tired smile. Start with feeling free. He let out something between a laugh and a sigh, shaking his head. Damn. The court buzzed with movement, people standing, whispering, packing up their things. That's when Simone saw him. Officer Badge 4071, standing in the back of the courtroom watching her. Her stomach coiled. She wasn't scared, but she knew this wasn't over. And then, he turned and walked out. Just like that. She didn't know if he had stayed to see if DeAndre would be convicted, or if he just wanted her to know he was still around. But she didn't care, because today, justice had won. At least for now. But then came the real question. Who reported her car stolen in the first place? Simone walked out of the courthouse with DeAndre by her side. The air was thick with something unspoken. Relief, exhaustion, maybe even anger. Reporters stood outside, cameras aimed, microphones waiting. The story had already spread. She didn't stop for them. Not yet. DeAndre exhaled. So, do I just go home now? Simone smiled. Yeah. You go home. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know how to thank you. She shook her head. Live your life. That's enough. He nodded, still processing everything. He turned to leave, but then hesitated. Ms. Caldwell? She looked at him. He swallowed. You think they really thought your car was stolen? That was the question, wasn't it? Simone didn't answer right away. She had her suspicions. Maybe it was a random mistake. Maybe it was a calculated move. Maybe someone in that courthouse, someone who didn't like how loud she was, wanted to remind her that no matter how many suits she wore, she could still be pulled from a courtroom like a criminal. She let out a slow breath. I think some people don't need proof to believe we don't belong. DeAndre nodded. He understood. He had always understood. Simone finally turned to the reporters. The cameras. The questions waiting to be answered. Because this wasn't just her story. It was bigger than that. She straightened her blazer, stepped forward, and spoke. Because silence was never an option. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in holding power accountable, use your voice. Speak out. Call it out. Because if we let moments like this slide, they won't just keep happening. They'll become the norm. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that need to be told, because the conversation doesn't stop here.